A rear-wheel drive mid-engine sports car based around a lightweight carbon fibre chassis. That'll be a McLaren or a Lamborghini, right? Not in this case. Alfa Romeo has long been a brand of unfulfilled promise. With the 4C, it gets right back on track. It's 30 years since we've seen a real Alfa Romeo for real people. Now, the wait's over. Welcome to the 4C. It's the car that will spearhead this brand's global revival, not in terms of sales, but significance. From being a manufacturer with a model range smaller than Ferrari, Alfa is being transformed, with new sports saloons and SUVs on the way for global buyers whose interest in this Milanese marque needs to be reawakened. It's this 4C's job to do just that, relaunching its maker into the States and offering the world an Alfa with the soul of a supercar. At a stroke, it returns us to the days of the company's classic models. The stylists talk of the Scaglione-designed Alfa 33 Stradale Coupe of 1967. For the engineers, the direct descendant is Pininfarina's Alfa Spider of 1966, rear-driven of course, like this 4C. Before this car, there hadn't been a rear-driven mainstream Alfa since the 75 Saloon of 1985, the last independently designed model made by the brand before it was acquired by Fiat. For enthusiasts like me, the memories are more modern, with plenty of design cues bringing to mind the car that borrowed the naming convention of Alfa's 6C and 8C sports cars of the 30s and 40s, the numerals designating the number of cylinders their engines used. I'm talking of the short-lived 8C Competizione supercar, launched in 2007 and assembled for this brand by Maserati, the very people who lovingly assembled this, its populist successor. That fact is significant. The decision early on to base this car on an exotic carbon fibre chassis of a kind shared only by an exclusive McLaren 650S supercar would normally mean equally exclusively small production numbers. Yet Alfa is firm in requiring Maserati to hand-build this car for sale in thousands, not in hundreds, and at a price that brings F1 technology to the modern person. This must, in short, be a legendary sports car almost anyone could aspire to. The kind of thing Alfa used to build, and a car we're going to put to the test. So, what's it like? Well, pretty special is the answer. You realise that from the moment you drop inside and ease yourself into the beautifully woven carbon fibre tub, the very thing that makes this car the lightweight racer it is. Filled with fluids, the 4C tips the scales at just 925 kilograms, fully 250 kilograms, or the weight of a couple of 20-stone prop forwards, lighter than the supposedly featherweight Lotus Exige. Use this to counter any disappointment that the engine behind is borrowed from an Alfa shopping hatch and offers only 4 cylinders and 240 brake horsepower. Comparably priced rivals deliver more than 300 brake horsepower, but then that's needed to offset the extra weight of their 6-cylinder engines. One thing that you won't have to worry yourself with is a clutch pedal. This car comes in twin-clutch sequential 6-speed auto form only. Ferrari will tell you that sports car buyers hardly ever buy stick-shift models anymore, so there simply wasn't any point in Alfa developing a manual transmission, no matter how much motoring journalists might want it. As a result, this gearbox has a self-shifting AM mode, but where's the fun in that? So instead, you punch this one button that'll engage first gear and tell the car that you'll take care of the cog swapping duties yourself using the wheel mounted paddle shifters. The experience awaits. Straight away, you're fired off the line with an urgency that's the exclusive preserve of a lightweight, powerful, thoroughbred sports car. If you've raced a single-seater, you'll recognise the feeling immediately. The light throttle and lack of inertia scrolling the horizon towards you on fast forward as you find yourself pinned back, enveloped in sound and frantically grabbing for second with a needle, flying round to the 6,500 RPM red line as if spring-loaded. Launch control is standard, but in the dry, it's hardly needed. 62 miles an hour from rest flashing by in a mere 4.5 seconds, provided you've used this DNA driving mode switch on the transmission tunnel to select either the dynamic or the race settings. With these, the throttle response sharpens and the cog changes become 130 millisecond rifle shot quick for your favourite twisting back route home. Rejoin the traffic and you can switch back to the softer, all-weather and natural modes that'll better suit your morning commute. Most four-cylinder turbocharged engines sound as charismatic as a Magimix, but this one has quite the repertoire, with a sharp exhaust bark when you gun the throttle and some dramatic wastegate chatter when you come off the gas. There's 350 Newton meters of torque that runs out at about the 5,500 RPM mark. Still, by then, you'll be travelling very fast indeed. On that subject, your answer to "what'll it do, mister?" is 160 miles an hour, which is certainly as fast as you'll probably want to go in this car once you've felt the way that the steering follows every ridge and undulation of the road surface. It's completely unassisted, you see. Yes, just like a Lotus or any proper old-school sports car, which means that at really high speed, you might initially find the rich, detailed feedback a little disconcerting. The front end writhing in your hands and the nose bobbing about like an old Porsche 911. Stick with it though, and the 4C will track true. Not that it's a very nice wheel, thick and oddly shaped. And of course, without modern electrical assistance, extremely heavy to use during parking manoeuvres that'll be a nightmare if you haven't stumped up for the extra cost rear parking sensors. As for ride quality, well, actually it's pretty good. At first glance, an ultra-stiff carbon chassis, low-profile tyres and suspension that doesn't seem to have a whole lot of travel would seem to be a recipe for getting some loyalty bonuses from your chiropractor. But the 4C is surprisingly supple. This, in fact, is one of the main things that makes this car so much more of an easier day-to-day drive than a Lotus would be. You don't necessarily have to always leave it in the garage for high days and holidays. Buy this car though, and you won't want to do that anyway. The light, rigid chassis, the wide track and a low centre of gravity, aided by a McLaren-style electronic Q2 limited slip diff, can only add up to truly astonishing road holding and cornering traction. If you've an ounce of petrol flowing through your veins, you'll love it. I've begun to wonder whether cars like this would ever be made anymore. Alfa still thinks they should be. You can further improve things too if you opt for the desirable racing pack that's fitted to the car that I have here, that adds the rear anti-roll bar, surprisingly left off the standard spec. There's a thicker front anti-roll bar too, plus sports suspension, stickier racing tyres and a more melodious exhaust. What else? Well, I've always thought that one of the true marks of a properly developed performance car is not how fast it goes, but how quickly it stops. The Italian race drivers who daily pounded development versions of this car around Alfa's classic Veloco test track and got within 15% of the time of an 887 brake horsepower Porsche 918 Spider supercar on the Nürburgring Nordschleife clearly thought so too. So the Brembo brakes are reassuringly overspecified for the amount of weight they have to handle, hauling the car to a standstill from 62 miles an hour in just 35 metres. For reference, the highway code reckons you need more than 55 metres for that manoeuvre. So that's a whole stack load of positives. What about the negatives? Well, there aren't really that many. Just about the biggest caveat I'd identify is the fact that the 4C doesn't really have a relaxed side to its nature. It's always on and always very loud. even at times you may not want it to be, say at cruising speeds when you're trying unsuccessfully to hear the feeble stereo. The TCT auto gearbox also lacks the usual creep function you'd expect on a self-shifter, so frustratingly you have to constantly prod at the accelerator pedal in stop-start traffic, all of which might prove wearing if you were thinking of this Alfa as a daily driver alternative to something like a Porsche Cayman. But if you're buying one of these as a fun car, you probably won't care about any of that. I must admit, I like the fact that Alfa haven't compromised. They've gone all out, and the 4C experience is one you're not going to forget in a hurry. Your first impressions of the 4C are of a bigger, more physically imposing car than the pictures suggest. True, it's only fractionally longer than a Lotus Elise, but it's virtually as wide as a luxury Mercedes SL, which gives it a pugnacious four-square look. There's certainly none of the daintiness that characterised, say, an early Alfa Spider. No, this thing looks like it means business. Stylist Alessandro Macalino talks of his inspiration for this shape being drawn from the achingly beautiful Alfa 33 Stradale Coupe of 1967. But when it comes to Italian mid-engine cars with an aggressive over-square footprint, enthusiasts are more likely to think of the iconic Lancia Stratos of the 70s, echoes of which travelled down through the years into this 4C model's side window shape, the arc at the base of its windscreen and the minimal overhangs. There's plenty else to catch the eye too, with elements of contemporary Ferrari design in the surfacing of the panels and spectacular alloy wheels that reference Alfa's beautiful 8C Competizione Coupe. There's a truly functional beauty to this car as well, say in the way the rear spoiler flows from the bodywork without interruption, or the way the rear end envelops the jewel-like tail lights. I haven't yet mentioned the headlamps because I can't be bothered with all the fuss that's been made about them. Actually, I happen to think that these optional bi-LED units look quite smart, but if you really don't like the look, there's talk of being able to retrofit coupe models with the sleeker one-piece units used on the open-top Spider version. For me, a greater blight on the sweeping shape is that, like so many contemporary Alfas, the front end of this one can be marred by having to fit a clumsy Great British number plate. Perhaps, as here, you should get your car registered in Italy. It's only when you have a look at the engineering cutaways of this car that you realise how tautly the outer skin is wrapped around the bits that matter. It's made from high-tech SMC, that's sheet moulding compound, a low-density material that's lighter than aluminium and completely appropriate for what is a competition-style automotive design. Quite literally, in fact, for the carbon underpinnings the 4C sits upon were created with the help of single-seater racing manufacturers Dallara. You can't avoid them, for as soon as you open the driver's door, there's a high sill to step across, fashioned from polished carbon-fibre weave. It's the same sort of thing you'd be faced with in a Lotus, except that there the tub would be fashioned from less sophisticated aluminium rather than a material previously limited to lottery-winning supercars. The slow process of creating this model's exotic chassis is one of the things that so restricts its production to just 3,500 cars a year for worldwide sale. Well, that and the fact that instead of rolling from Alfa's mechanised production line, it's hand-built in Modena for the brand by Maserati, where it's fashioned alongside Quattroportes, Gran Turismo and Gran Cabrio models at the company's famous city centre plant in the Viale Ciro Menotti. Levering yourself into the cockpit doesn't leave you resorting to quite the sort of gymnastics required of an Exige driver, but it's still enough to imbue a race-ready feel. Get your foot in first, then slide down into this beautifully supported bucket seat, then heave your other leg in, and you're greeted with this competition-style cabin dedicated to the pursuit of performance. You even need a seat fitting to properly drive it, with the exact seat height set up for you when you collect the car from your dealer. Unfortunately, that means it can't be adjusted again unless you reach for your spanners, and the passenger seat can't be adjusted at all. Like everything else in this car, it's all a part of weight-saving design, further evidence of which is found with the simple leather pull handles on the doors, the light but durable plastics, and glass reduced in thickness by 15%. Really dedicated folk can even pare back another few pounds by deleting the air conditioning and stereo systems. Don't go expecting the fashionable tactility you'd get from a Porsche or from just about every other sports car you could buy for this price apart from a Lotus. The dash materials are a bit scratchy. There's borrowed Fiat switchgear. The paddle shifters feel thin and plasticky, and it doesn't help that the curiously shaped steering wheel is far from an aesthetic triumph. Alfa's argument, of course, is that dealing with all of these issues would have added back in all that saved weight. But I think you can keep something light and still make it look great. Apple can do it with a MacBook Air. Pinarello can do it with a push bike. Alfa should be able to do it with an interior. They're Italians. They ought to be able to make things look good. What I do like is this in-dash TFT screen, which carries a big electronic tacho surrounded by a digital readout of your speed, gear, temperature, fuel, and that most crucial piece of driving information, the date. Don't ask. Switch the car into the race dynamic setting that you'll find on the transmission tunnel DNA driving mode selector, and you'll notice the whole display change shape and colour as you adjust to the sharper throttle, the quicker gear changes, and the fact that, rather bravely, if you're on a public road, you've opted to do without the safety net of stability control. So you'll need to be at your best behind the wheel, fortunately aided by a nigh-on perfect seating position with little in the way of pedal offset. Even that awful steering wheel redeems itself a little here by offering up a decent amount of adjustability. The rear view, though, is dreadful, and the best investment you can make after having decided on a 4C is either some foam padding at the back of your garage or the extra cost set of parking sensors. Now, even that won't completely help with every aspect of parallel parking, thanks to invisible wings, wheel rims and wheel arches that all but disappear from view the moment that reverse is selected. While I'm sounding practical, I'll point out that there's no glove box, though you do get a couple of cup holders underneath your elbow, along with 2 slots beneath the dashboard where you could possibly slot a bag of Haribos or your inevitable speeding tickets. As for the storage of larger items, well, you might expect a mid-engined Alfa, like a comparable mid-engined Porsche, to give you trunk space both at the front and the rear, in which case you'll be disappointed. There's no front boot, or frunk as these things are apparently now known, with the area you'd normally think of as the bonnet instead being fastened firmly shut. Instead, carriage capacity is limited to 110 litres. About the same as you'd get in a Lotus, but a quarter of the size of the total space provided by a Porsche Cayman. Enough perhaps for a squashy bag or two on a weekend away, but the heat soak from the engine and exhaust will be so great on the scenic route back from Sainsbury's that your eggs will probably be soft-boiled by the time you get them home. Really dedicated owners even opt to do without this strut that holds up the boot lid, fully embracing the weight-saving regime. You've got to love that level of fanaticism. How do you price a car like this? After all, what exactly is its competition? It must have been difficult for Alfa Romeo to know. In the event, they chose a £45,000 asking figure that pitches this model midway between the 2 rivals most of the magazines have been talking about, Porsche's Cayman 2.7 and the Lotus Exige. Now, to be honest, I don't think either of these cars are much of a direct match for this 4C. They're both heavier 6-cylinder models for a start, with the Lotus cruder and the Porsche 2 genteel. The Look at a 4C in open-top Spider form, for which you'll need a £50,000 budget, and you might see the kind of supercharged Lotus Elise that would save you around £15,000 as a closer match. But again, that's more of a track day roadster than an everyday driver, and its old school execution is Betamax tape in a digital world. That's not to say that any Lotus isn't still hugely capable and enjoyable, but things have moved on, as this 4C so ably demonstrates. Driving it is so much more of an experience than anything a conventional £45,000 sports car can serve up, say an Audi TTS or a BMW Z4 S-Drive 35IS. Alfa could have offered us more power for the same kind of cash if they ditched the expensive carbon fibre lightweight underpinnings and put in the kind of bigger engine rivals offer. But it's that very chassis that defines the agile, eager appeal of this car. Lose that and you lose the point. So, what do you get when you hand over £45,000 to your Alfa dealer? Standard equipment includes launch control, sports seats, drilled aluminium pedals, electric windows and a radio, while air conditioning, web applications and Bluetooth phone connection are no-cost options. You really need to pay extra for rear parking sensors. I'd want to find a bit more for a proper spare wheel and a luggage kit too. Less important extras include painted brake calipers, cruise control and an upgraded hi-fi speaker system you probably won't be able to hear most of the time. Oh, and the fancy bi-LED headlamps and leather sports seats with microfiber inserts you get as part of a pricey luxury pack. One thing to look out for is that you'll be charged extra if you want any colour other than black. Quite a lot more, in fact. This car's metallic Alfa Red finish is £600 extra, but you get a bill for over £2,000 more if you opt for one of the fancier tri-coat colours, Competizione Red or Madreperla White. You might also want to splash out on the optional racing pack too, to create a car like the one I have here. Do that and a £3,000 outlay gives you bigger wheels, 18 inches at the front and 19 inches at the back, stickier AR racing tyres, a sports exhaust, a sports steering wheel, a thicker front anti-roll bar and a further anti-roll bar added at the rear. Every 4C comes with ABS brakes, a hill holder function, stability control and a tyre pressure warning system. But it's surprising that there are just 2 airbags, the 4C not even offering side bags as an option. The standard security equipment includes a tilt switch alarm that can detect if the car is being lifted. Now, you probably don't buy a car like the Alfa Romeo 4C with cost of ownership figures at the forefront of your mind. But one happy consequence of the modestly sized engine and the dainty curb weight is that everyday running costs are much lower than most cars with this level of performance. Alfa quote a combined fuel economy figure of 41.5 miles to the gallon, which is a good deal better than, say, a less powerful 217 brake horsepower supercharged Lotus Elise. We've given this one quite a good pedaling, and when we refilled it, we were amazed that it had returned slightly better than 30 miles to the gallon. That's quite something for a 160 mile an hour sports car. Emissions are correspondingly low, with 157 grams per kilometre being less than you'd get from some current Mini models. To be specific, a far more feebly powered Mini Roadster JCW can only manage 39.8 miles to the gallon and 165 grams per kilometre. As for more direct rivals, well, a Porsche Cayman 2.7 PDK is about 15% thirstier and dirtier. And as for a Lotus Exige, well, it can't even crack the 30 miles to the gallon barrier, and it belches out 236 grams per kilometre of CO2. All of which explains why this model stacks up on the kind of balance sheet where it'll probably never feature. I can't imagine anyone buying this as a company car, but if you were to, as a high earner, you'd save yourself nearly £650 a year over what you pay to run a manual Porsche Cayman 2.7. build quality issues shouldn't feature. The Maserati production facility assembles this car alongside its own models, costing 3 times as much, and takes 20 minutes to build each car, rather than the 52nd mechanised production line industry average. As with any Maserati, every 4C is road tested for 40 kilometres by an expert enthusiast before it leaves the factory. Reassuring, isn't it, to know that someone else has already had a hoon around in your 4C before you've even sat in it. Servicing isn't going to be a headache either, as all of Alfa's dealers are authorised to work on this vehicle. You'll need to service it every year or 12,500 miles. Finally, residual values are outstanding, especially in the short term, with lengthy waiting lists characterising this car. In other words, if you do get your hands on a 4C and then decide it's not for you, you're certainly not going to get your fingers burnt. Whether you're talking cars or creatures, evolution isn't a smooth process, but it's punctuated by landmarks that redefine the process. If we apply that to sports cars, these step changes are models that have reset market standards. Designs like the Lotus Elise, Nissan's GT-R and Porsche's 911. To this exclusive club, we can add another member, this Alfa Romeo 4C. Why? Well, because it changes the way that affordable sports cars can be built, with carbon fibre underpinnings, previously restricted to exotic McLarens, Ferraris and Lamborghinis, yet here available for less than you'd pay for an entry-level Porsche Cayman that's had a few options thrown at it. And it's a true driver's car, more extreme in its execution than most of us expected. It's as if Alfa gave vent to years of frustration at being fobbed off with front-wheel drive Fiat platforms and decided to imbue this machine with everything they had. The very fact that we've finally got a mid-engined rear-wheel drive Alfa Romeo is enough to get the pulses racing. At last! And it looks fantastic. This car is nowhere near perfect, of course. Alfas never were. Parts of the interior don't quite match the required price tag, and some of the finer points of its dynamics aren't as polished as you get in a Lotus product. The exciting, immersive driving experience can also be wearing at length, but that's the way it should be in a car like this. It should be an event every time you fire it up. You ought to be unable to walk away without turning your head to look for a final time. And small kids should want to be photographed with it. This isn't a Lotus Exige or a Porsche Cayman. It's something altogether more exotic. It's the Alfa we'd hoped and prayed for 30 years. It doesn't disappoint.